the Landkreuzer 1500 Monster. Let's start with the most ridiculous one, the Landkreuzer P.1500 Monster. And yes, that's its actual name. The Germans looked at battleships and thought, you know what would be cool? Let's put one of those on land. This thing was supposed to weigh 1,500 tons. 1,500 tons. To put that in perspective, a modern main battle tank weighs about 60 tons. This monster would have been 25 times heavier. It was designed to carry the Schwerer Gustav gun, which was an 800mm railway artillery piece, the same gun that needed an entire train to transport it and a crew of over 1,000 soldiers to assemble and operate. The P-1500 would have been about 115 feet long. That's longer than a blue whale. It would have been 45 feet wide, which means it couldn't fit on any road, any bridge, or through any town without demolishing everything in its path. The tracks alone would have been about 10 feet wide each, and it would have needed multiple submarine diesel engines just to move. Here's the kicker. The engineers estimated it could move at about 9 miles per hour on flat ground. 9 miles per hour. You could literally outrun this thing on a bicycle. And that's assuming it didn't sink into the ground, which it probably would have, because 1,500 tons concentrated on tracks would have turned most terrain into a muddy crater. The secondary armament was supposed to include 250mm howitzers and multiple anti-aircraft guns. It would have needed a crew of over 100 people just to operate all the systems. Imagine coordinating 100 soldiers inside a moving vehicle while trying to aim a battleship gun at something miles away. The logistics alone make your head spin. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, actually canceled this project in 1943. Even the Nazis looked at this thing and said, yeah, this is too crazy. When the people who built the V-2 rocket and the Tiger tank think your idea is impractical, you know you've gone too far. The P-1500 Monster never made it past the design phase, but the fact that serious engineers spent time calculating how to make a land battleship tells you everything about the wild ambition of wartime engineering.
Panzerkampfwagen VIII Maus. Now, unlike the Monster, the Maus actually got built. 2 prototypes were completed, and this thing was the heaviest tank ever constructed. We're talking about 188 tons of steel, armor, and firepower. The Maus, which ironically means mouse in German, was anything but small. It measured about 33 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 11 feet tall. The armor was insane. The front armor was over 9 inches thick, 9 inches of solid steel. You could hit this thing with pretty much any anti-tank weapon from World War II, and it would just shrug it off like a mosquito bite. It carried a 128mm main gun and a coaxial 75mm gun. That's 2 tank cannons on 1 turret. The 128mm gun could punch through any Allied tank from over 2 miles away. The problem? Everything else about this tank. First, it was too heavy to cross bridges. Engineers knew this from the start, so they designed it to be able to drive underwater across river bottoms. Yeah, you read that right. They were going to submerge a 188-ton tank and drive it along the riverbed. They built a snorkel system and waterproofing for this exact purpose. The Maus would connect to another Maus on the opposite bank via cable for electrical power while crossing because the engine couldn't get air underwater. The engine was a massive V12 aircraft engine that produced about 1,200 horsepower. Sounds like a lot until you realize it was pushing nearly 200 tons. The Maus had a top speed of about 8 miles per hour on roads and maybe 4 miles per hour off-road. It guzzled fuel like crazy, getting about a mile per 30 gallons. You'd need a fuel truck following it constantly just to keep it moving. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed before the war ended. When Soviet forces were closing in on the testing grounds, the Germans destroyed both Maus tanks to prevent capture. But the Soviets recovered parts from both and combined them into one complete vehicle. That mouse now sits in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, where you can actually see it today. It's a monument to the idea that sometimes bigger is just bigger, not better.
France decided to get in on the super heavy tank game too, but they did it earlier than everyone else. The Char 2C was developed during World War I and was the first super heavy tank to actually see production. This thing was enormous for its time. It weighed about 75 tons and was almost 34 feet long, making it one of the longest tanks ever built. What made it really weird was the crew requirement. It needed 12 people to operate. 12! Most tanks today need 3 or 4 crew members. This thing needed an entire squad. The crew included a driver, a commander, a gunner for the main 75mm gun, a loader for the main gun, a gunner for the rear machine gun turret, a mechanic, an electrician, and several more soldiers to handle other machine guns and systems. It was less like operating a tank and more like running a small ship. The interior had multiple compartments, kind of like rooms in a house, which is why some people called it a palace on tracks. The Char 2C had armor that was relatively thick for World War I, about 1.5 inches maximum. It could move at about 7 miles per hour, which was actually decent for its weight and the era. The tracks wrapped around the entire length of the hull, giving it good trench crossing ability, which was the main goal since it was designed for trench warfare. France built 10 of these tanks between 1917 and 1921. By the time World War II started, they were hopelessly outdated. The armor that seemed impressive in 1918 was useless against 1940s anti-tank weapons. The French tried to move them to the front lines when Germany invaded in 1940, but it was a disaster. They transported them by rail because they were too slow to drive long distances. German aircraft spotted the trains and destroyed most of them before they ever reached the battlefield. One Char 2C was captured intact by the Germans, who used it for propaganda photos before eventually scrapping it. Not a single Char 2C ever fired a shot in combat during World War II.
T-42, Soviet multi-turret tank. The Soviets had their own crazy ideas about tank design, and the T-42 concept represents the peak of their multi-turret obsession. During the 1930s, Soviet engineers were convinced that multiple turrets were the future of tank warfare. Their thinking was simple. More turrets mean more guns. More guns mean more targets you can engage at once. The T-42 was a design that featured 3 turrets stacked in a pyramid formation. Yes, 3 turrets. One main turret on top with a 76mm gun, and 2 smaller turrets on the sides with 45mm guns and machine guns. The idea was that this tank could fight multiple enemies simultaneously in different directions. The projected weight was around 60 tons, which would have made it incredibly heavy for the 1930s. The armor was planned to be about 3 inches thick on the front, which was very heavy for that era. It would have had a crew of at least 7 people, with multiple gunners trying to coordinate their fire while the tank moved. The engineering challenges were enormous. Coordinating 3 different turrets, each with its own gunner, while moving across rough terrain was basically impossible with 1930s technology. There was no computer system to help. It was all manual communication, probably by shouting or intercom if they were lucky. The weight distribution was another nightmare. Having 2 turrets at the front and 1 elevated in the back created all kinds of balance issues. Soviet military trials with earlier multi-turret designs, like the T-35, showed that the concept was fundamentally flawed. In combat, multiple turrets just meant multiple things that could break down. The tanks were maintenance nightmares. Crews couldn't effectively coordinate fire. The extra weight made the tanks slow and unreliable. And here's the real problem. A tank with 3 small guns was less effective than a tank with 1 big gun. The T-42 never progressed beyond design studies. Soviet engineers eventually abandoned the multi-turret concept entirely in favor of single-turret designs like the T-34, which proved to be one of the best tank designs of World War II. The T-42 remains a fascinating what-if in Soviet tank development, a road not taken that probably would have led to disaster if they'd pursued it.
Antonov A40 flying tank. Now we're getting into the truly bizarre. The Soviet Union, not satisfied with just building tanks or just building aircraft, decided to combine them. The Antonov A40 was a genuine attempt to create a flying tank. The concept was actually kind of clever, at least on paper. Soviet paratroopers needed armored support, but dropping a tank from an airplane was impossible with 1940s technology. So engineer Oleg Antonov came up with a wild solution: attach wings to a tank and have it glide to the battlefield. They took a T-60 light tank, which weighed about 6 tons, and built a massive biplane glider cradle around it. The contraption had a wingspan of nearly 60 feet. The idea was that a bomber would tow the whole thing into the air, fly it over enemy territory, and then release it. The tank crew would be inside the flight, controlling the glide using the tank's normal controls connected to the wing surfaces. In 1942, they actually tested it. They attached the A-40 to a Tupolev TB-3 bomber and took off. And here's the amazing part: it actually flew. The tank with wings got into the air and glided. For a brief moment, a flying tank was real. But of course, there were massive problems. The TB-3 bomber struggled with the weight and couldn't climb to a safe altitude. The tow cable created enormous drag. The bomber pilot had to release the A-40 early, much lower and closer to the airfield than planned. The tank glided down and landed hard but intact. The test pilot, who was also inside the tank during this insanity, walked away without injury. After landing, they detached the wings and the T-60 drove away under its own power. Technically, the test was a success. They'd proven a tank could fly and then fight. But practically, it was a disaster. The Soviets didn't have bombers powerful enough to tow the contraption to useful combat ranges. The whole system was too complex, too dangerous, and too limited in application. The program was canceled after that single test flight. No other attempts were made. But the Antonov A40 remains one of the most creative and insane solutions ever proposed to a military problem. It exists in that sweet spot of engineering where something is simultaneously brilliant and completely ridiculous.
Finally, we have perhaps the most mysterious vehicle on this list. The Kugelpanzer, which translates to ball tank, is a tiny spherical armored vehicle that looks like something a cartoon character would drive. But it was real, and we still don't know exactly what it was for. This thing is tiny. It's about 5 feet in diameter and weighs maybe 2 tons. It looks like a hamster ball made of steel with a tiny turret on top. There's a single track that runs around the middle, kind of like a rolling barrel, powered by a small engine. The crew would be one person, probably lying down or crouched inside this cramped metal sphere. Here's what makes it so mysterious. We don't know who built it or why. The only surviving example was captured by Soviet forces from Japanese forces in Manchuria at the end of World War II. This suggests it might have been a German vehicle sent to Japan, or possibly a Japanese creation inspired by German designs. But there are no surviving documents, no blueprints, no manuals. Theories about its purpose are all over the place. Some think it was a reconnaissance vehicle meant to roll forward, observe enemy positions, and roll back. The small size and odd shape might have made it hard to hit. Others suggest it was meant for laying communication cables under fire. Some speculate it was designed for close-range combat in urban environments, where its small size would be an advantage. The armament was minimal, probably just a light machine gun or even nothing at all. The armor was thin, maybe half an inch, enough to stop small arms fire, but nothing heavier. It couldn't have moved very fast, probably no more than 5 or 6 miles per hour. The only surviving Kugelpanzer is in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, the same place that houses the Maus. It's been there since the end of World War II, rusting and silent, keeping its secrets. Researchers have studied it, but without documentation, we're mostly guessing at its true purpose. What we do know is that someone, somewhere, thought a ball-shaped tank was a good idea and actually built it, and that alone makes it one of the strangest armored vehicles ever created.